In the world of international diplomacy, some conversations are never meant to see daylight. When President Marcus Steele's private remarks about Crown Prince Alexander of Valdoria leaked during a supposedly confidential summit, it didn't just threaten diplomatic relations. It exposed a web of political intrigue, personal vendettas, and hidden agendas that reached the highest levels of both governments. What started as an off-the-cuff comment would spiral into an international crisis that would test alliances, destroy careers, and reveal that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones sitting at your own table. The autumn wind carried a chill through the ornate windows of Pemberton Castle as President Marcus Steele adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes. The historic venue, chosen for its neutral ground between the United States and the Kingdom of Valdoria, felt more like a stage set for political theater than a place for serious diplomatic discourse. Steele had been in politics long enough to know that these carefully choreographed summits rarely produced anything beyond photo opportunities and carefully worded joint statements. But this particular meeting felt different. King Edmund VII of Valdoria sat across the mahogany conference table, his weathered face betraying none of the tension that had been building between their nations over the past 6 months. The trade disputes, military-based negotiations, and environmental policy disagreements had created a diplomatic minefield that both leaders were attempting to navigate without triggering an international incident. "Your Majesty," Steele began, his characteristic directness cutting through the formal atmosphere. "I think we both know why we're really here. The Northfield Island situation isn't going to resolve itself through diplomatic pleasantries. The Northfield Islands had become a contentious issue after valuable mineral deposits were discovered in the waters surrounding the Valdorian territory. American corporations, backed by significant political lobbying, were pressing for drilling rights, while Valdorian environmental groups and Crown Prince Alexander had been vocal opponents of any industrial development in the region. King Edmund nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. "Indeed, President Steele, though I must say, your country's approach to these negotiations has been rather aggressive." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Steele had built his political career on being the candidate who told it like it was, often at the expense of diplomatic niceties. His approval ratings soared when he spoke bluntly about America's interests, but those same characteristics had created friction in international relations. Secretary of State Margaret Chun, sitting to Steele's right, shot him a warning glance. She had spent weeks preparing for this summit, crafting careful language and building bridges with her Valdorian counterparts. The last thing they needed was for the president to go off script in the opening minutes of the most important diplomatic meeting of the year. "Your Majesty," Chun interjected smoothly, "perhaps we could begin with areas where our interests align. The renewable energy initiative, for instance, has shown tremendous promise for both our nations." But Steele was already shifting in his seat, his jaw set in the way that his staff had learned to recognize as a warning sign. He had opinions about the Valdorian approach to the negotiations, particularly about Crown Prince Alexander's environmental activism, and keeping those opinions to himself had never been his strong suit. "Before we get into the technical details," Steele said, his voice carrying the confident tone that had won him elections, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Your son's involvement in these discussions." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. King Edmund's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, while Chun felt her stomach sink. This was exactly the kind of unscripted moment they had hoped to avoid. Crown Prince Alexander, 32 years old and increasingly popular among young Valdorians, had become the unofficial face of environmental resistance to American industrial interests. His speeches at universities, his social media presence, and his ability to mobilize protesters had made him a significant factor in the political equation. American corporate interests viewed him as an obstacle, while his supporters saw him as a principled defender of Valdorian sovereignty. "My son," King Edmund replied carefully, "speaks as a private citizen on matters of environmental concern." Steele leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the same expression he wore during televised debates when he sensed weakness in an opponent's position. With all due respect, Your Majesty, we both know that's not entirely accurate. When the heir to the throne speaks, people listen. And when he speaks against American interests, he speaks for the future of our planet, interrupted Prince Alexander himself, who had just entered the room with his security detail. The young prince moved with the confidence of someone born to leadership, but tempered by genuine conviction. His environmental science degree from Cambridge and his work with international conservation organizations had given him credibility beyond his royal title. He was tall like his father, but where King Edmund carried the weight of years of diplomatic compromise, Alexander radiated the energy of someone who believed change was not only possible, but necessary. Steele sized up the prince immediately. In American politics, he had dealt with plenty of young idealists who confused passion with wisdom. Your Highness, he said, standing to shake Alexander's hand, I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk. The handshake lasted a moment longer than protocol dictated, both men taking each other's measure. Alexander had studied Steele's political career extensively, understanding that the American president's populist appeal came from his ability to position himself as an outsider fighting against established interests, even while representing the most powerful nation on earth. I've followed your career as well, Mr. President, Alexander said. Your ability to speak directly to people is noteworthy. There was just enough edge in the compliment to suggest it wasn't entirely flattering. Steele caught the implication, but chose to treat it as praise. I believe in honest communication, Your Highness. People deserve to know where their leaders stand. As they returned to their seats, the real negotiations began in earnest. The formal agenda covered trade agreements, military cooperation, and environmental standards, but the subtext was a clash of worldviews. Steele represented a vision of American leadership that prioritized economic growth and national interests, while Alexander embodied a new generation of leaders who viewed environmental protection and global cooperation as existential necessities. The morning session proceeded with typical diplomatic courtesy, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Every exchange of position papers and treaty language was filtered through the personal dynamics playing out around the conference table. Chun worked tirelessly to keep discussions on track, while Valdorian Foreign Minister Dame Elizabeth Thornton mirrored her efforts from the other side. During a coffee break, Steele found himself standing near one of the castle's ancient windows, looking out at the meticulously maintained gardens. The view was peaceful, almost anachronistic in contrast to the high-stakes negotiations taking place inside. Alexander approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Black, no sugar, the prince said, offering 1 cup to Steele. I asked your staff. Thank you, Steele replied, genuinely surprised by the gesture. You know, Your Highness, in another context, I think you and I might actually get along. Alexander sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Perhaps, though I suspect we disagree on fundamental questions about leadership and responsibility, such as whether a leader's primary obligation is to their own people's immediate interests or to the long-term welfare of humanity as a whole. It was a sophisticated challenge, delivered without rancor, but with clear intent. Steele respected directness, even when it came from political opponents. I was elected to represent American interests, Your Highness. That's democracy. And I was born to represent Valdorian interests, Alexander replied. But I believe those interests include leaving a habitable planet for future generations. The conversation was interrupted by an aide informing them that the afternoon session was about to begin. As they walked back toward the conference room, neither man realized that their exchange had been overheard by James Morrison, a junior staffer from the American delegation who had been tasked with documenting informal interactions for the trip report. Morrison, ambitious and eager to prove his value to the administration, had been taking notes on everything. The casual conversation between Steele and Alexander struck him as potentially significant, though he wasn't entirely sure why. He made a mental note to include it in his detailed briefing document. The afternoon session focused on the specific language of proposed agreements. Legal teams from both sides parsed every word, every clause, every potential interpretation. It was the kind of tedious but crucial work that formed the backbone of international relations, far removed from the dramatic headlines that captured public attention. But as the day wore on, the fundamental tensions became more apparent. The American delegation pushed for expedited environmental reviews and streamlined approval processes for business investments in Valdoria. The Valdorian team, led by Dame Elizabeth but clearly influenced by Alexander's presence, insisted on stronger environmental protections and more robust oversight mechanisms. What we're seeing here, Steele said during one particularly heated exchange, is a fundamental disconnect between theoretical idealism and practical reality. The Northfield project alone could provide thousands of jobs and millions in tax revenue, and potentially irreversible environmental damage, Alexander responded. Mr. President, with respect, your country has a track record of prioritizing short-term economic gains over long-term environmental consequences. The comment clearly irritated Steele, whose environmental record had been a persistent source of criticism from political opponents. His administration had rolled back numerous environmental regulations in the name of economic competitiveness, arguing that excessive restrictions hurt American workers and businesses. Your Highness, Steele replied, his voice tightening slightly. America has lifted more people out of poverty through economic growth than any environmental program in history. Perhaps, Alexander said calmly, but prosperity means very little if it comes at the cost of a livable planet. Chun recognized the warning signs of an escalating confrontation and smoothly redirected the discussion toward technical specifications and implementation timelines. But the fundamental philosophical divide had been exposed, and both sides knew it would need to be addressed before any meaningful agreement could be reached. As the formal sessions concluded for the day, both delegations retreated to their respective quarters to strategize for the following day's negotiations. The American team gathered in a secure conference room, while Steele reviewed briefing documents and prepared for a call with congressional leadership back in Washington. How do you think it went? Chin asked, settling into a chair across from the president's desk. Steele looked up from his papers, loosening his tie. The kid's smart. Smarter than I expected. But he's also naive about how the world actually works. Sir, with respect, Prince Alexander has advanced degrees in environmental science and economics. He's not just some idealistic college student. Maybe not, Steele conceded, but he's still thinking like an academic instead of a leader. When you're responsible for millions of jobs and a $1 trillion economy, environmental purity becomes a luxury you can't always afford. Chin had worked in both Democratic and Republican administrations, and she understood the political pressures that shaped presidential decision-making. But she also recognized that the next generation of world leaders, represented by figures like Prince Alexander, operated from different assumptions about global priorities and national responsibilities. Sir, regardless of our disagreements with his positions, the prince has significant influence in Valdoria. If we can't find common ground with him, these negotiations are going to be much more difficult. Steele nodded, understanding the political calculus even if he disagreed with Alexander's worldview. What do you suggest? Tomorrow morning, before the formal sessions resume, perhaps you could have a private conversation with him. One-on-one, no staff, no formal agenda. Just two leaders talking honestly about their concerns and priorities. It was a reasonable suggestion, and Steele had built his career on his ability to connect with people across political divides. His populist appeal came partly from his willingness to engage directly with critics and skeptics, though usually in controlled environments where he held the advantage. Set it up, he said finally. But make it clear that this is a courtesy, not a concession. I'm not going to be lectured about environmental policy by someone who's never had to make hard choices about economic trade-offs. Meanwhile, in the Valdorian delegation's quarters, a different conversation was taking place. King Edmund had requested a private meeting with his son, away from the formal diplomatic machinery that surrounded their every public interaction. Alexander, The king began, "I appreciate your passion on these environmental issues. Your mother would be proud of the man you've become." The reference to Queen Victoria, who had died 3 years earlier in a car accident, always brought a moment of sadness to both men. She had been not only Alexander's mother, but also his closest advisor and confidant, someone who had helped him understand how to balance royal duty with personal conviction. "She always said that privilege comes with responsibility," Alexander replied. "Not just to our own people, but to the world." Yes, she did. But she also understood the importance of diplomatic relationships and the need to work within existing systems to create change. King Edmund had spent 40 years navigating international relations, building alliances, and managing the delicate balance between Valdorian sovereignty and global interdependence. He respected his son's convictions, but worried about the practical implications of uncompromising positions. "Father, President Steele represents everything that's wrong with short-term political thinking. He's willing to sacrifice environmental protection for immediate economic gains, and he expects us to go along with it because of America's economic and military power." "Perhaps," the king said carefully, "but he's also the leader of our most important ally, and alienating him serves no one's interests. Change happens through engagement, not confrontation." The conversation continued late into the evening, father and son wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. How do you balance immediate economic needs with long-term environmental survival? How do you work within existing power structures while advocating for fundamental change? How do you maintain diplomatic relationships while standing firm on core principles? These were the questions that would shape the remaining negotiations, and both men knew that the decisions made over the next few days would have consequences far beyond their immediate political objectives. As night fell over Pemberton Castle, neither delegation fully understood that their carefully planned summit was about to be derailed by forces beyond their control. James Morrison, the ambitious junior staffer, was working late in his hotel room, compiling his notes from the day's interactions and preparing his preliminary report for senior staff review. His document included detailed observations about negotiating positions, personality dynamics, and potential areas for compromise. But it also included his interpretation of the casual conversation between President Steele and Prince Alexander, along with Morrison's speculation about what Steele really thought about the young prince's environmental activism. Morrison's ambition exceeded his judgment, and his desire to demonstrate insight led him to embellish and interpret rather than simply report. He transformed Steele's measured skepticism about Alexander's positions into something more personal and inflammatory, adding context and implications that reflected Morrison's own biases rather than actual events. The report was scheduled for distribution the following morning, just as the crucial second day of negotiations was set to begin. What Morrison didn't realize was that his document would soon become the center of an international incident that would overshadow every carefully planned diplomatic initiative and expose the fragile nature of international relations in an age of instant communication and political opportunism. Dawn broke gray and drizzly over Pemberton Castle, matching the somber mood that had settled over both delegations as they prepared for the second day of negotiations. President Steele had risen early, reviewing position papers while drinking his usual black coffee and scanning overnight news reports from the American media. The summit had generated significant coverage, with most outlets focusing on the high stakes of the trade and environmental discussions. Secretary Chun knocked softly on his suite door at 7:30, carrying a tablet loaded with the morning's intelligence briefings and diplomatic cables. "Good morning, Mr. President. I have the overnight reports, and I've arranged that private conversation with Prince Alexander for 8:15 before the formal session begins." Steele nodded, straightening his tie. "Any developments I need to know about?" "Nothing major. Some positive coverage in the European press about the summit's potential for breakthrough agreements. The environmental groups are watching closely, and there's significant social media activity from both American and Valdorian constituencies. What Chen didn't yet know was that James Morrison's report had been distributed electronically to the senior staff at 6 a.m. as scheduled. The document had been marked for internal review only, but in a modern world of government communications, the line between internal and external often blurred in unexpected ways. Dr. Sarah Williams, the delegation's environmental policy advisor, had received Morrison's report along with a dozen other overnight briefings. As she scrolled through the document during her morning coffee, one particular section caught her attention. Morrison had written about what he characterized as President Steele's dismissive attitude toward Prince Alexander, including what Morrison claimed were off-the-record comments about the prince's naive environmental extremism and his role as an obstacle to rational economic policy. Williams had worked closely with both Chun and the president on environmental issues throughout the administration. While she knew Steele often expressed frustration with what he saw as unrealistic environmental demands, the language in Morrison's report seemed unusually harsh and personal. More concerning, it didn't match her recollection of how the president typically discussed international figures, even ones with whom he disagreed. She made a mental note to clarify the quotes with Morrison later, but the immediate demands of preparation for the day's negotiations pushed the concern to the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander was having breakfast with Dame Elizabeth Thornton in the Valdorian delegation's private dining room. The foreign minister had served 3 different monarchs over her distinguished career, and her experience with American politics dated back to the Reagan administration. "Your Highness," she said, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "today's discussions will likely focus on implementation mechanisms and timeline issues. The Americans will push for fast-track procedures, while we'll need to insist on adequate oversight and environmental review periods." Alexander nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent much of the night thinking about his conversation with his father and the broader implications of the negotiations. The Northfield Islands represented more than just an environmental issue or economic opportunity. They symbolized the fundamental question of whether small nations could maintain their sovereignty in the face of pressure from global superpowers. "Dame Elizabeth," he said finally, "what's your assessment of President Steele as a negotiator? Not his political positions, but his personal approach to these kinds of discussions." The foreign minister considered her words carefully. "He's more sophisticated than his public persona suggests, but he's also genuinely committed to advancing what he sees as American interests. He's not merely posturing for domestic political consumption. He believes in his approach. That makes him both more predictable and more dangerous than leaders who are simply playing political games." Dangerous how? Because true believers are harder to compromise with than opportunists. An opportunist will make deals when the price is right. A true believer will walk away from negotiations if he can't get what he thinks is necessary for his country. Their conversation was interrupted by an aide informing them that President Steele had requested a private meeting with the prince before the formal session began. Alexander felt a moment of apprehension. One-on-one meetings with foreign leaders were always delicate, particularly when fundamental disagreements were involved. 20 minutes later, Alexander found himself in a small study adjacent to the main conference room, facing President Steele across a coffee table laden with documents and briefing papers. The room felt intimate after the formal grandeur of the main negotiating space, and both men seemed to relax slightly in the less ceremonial environment. "Your Highness," Steele began, "I want to talk with you directly about where we go from here. Yesterday's discussions made it clear that we see some of these issues very differently." Alexander appreciated the straightforward approach. "Yes, Mr. President, though I hope we can find common ground despite our philosophical differences. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. Look, I understand your environmental concerns, and I'm not some corporate puppet who doesn't care about pollution or climate change. But I also have to think about American workers who need jobs, American companies that need to compete globally, and American consumers who need affordable energy." It was a reasonable statement of his position, delivered without the rhetorical flourishes that characterized his public speeches. Alexander found himself respecting Steele's directness, even while disagreeing with his priorities. I appreciate your honesty, Mr. President. But from my perspective, environmental protection isn't a luxury that we can afford after we've solved economic problems. It's a prerequisite for long-term economic stability. Climate change, pollution, and resource depletion are economic issues as much as environmental ones. Steele leaned back in his chair, studying the young prince. You know, if you were an American politician, you'd probably be running against me in the next election. The comment was made with a slight smile, suggesting it was meant as a compliment rather than criticism. Alexander smiled back. Perhaps, though I suspect American politics is more complicated than Valdorian constitutional monarchy. You have no idea, Steele replied with genuine amusement. But here's my point. In American politics, I have to build coalitions that include coal miners in West Virginia, oil workers in Texas, and environmental activists in California. Everybody wants their concerns addressed, and nobody wants to sacrifice for someone else's priorities. And how do you balance those competing demands? Honestly, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to choose, and somebody's going to be unhappy. The question is whether you make those choices based on what's best for the country in the long run, or based on what keeps you in office in the short run. It was a moment of unexpected candor from Steele, revealing the genuine complexity of democratic leadership in a way that his public statements rarely did. Alexander found himself viewing the American president as a more nuanced figure than his previous impressions had suggested. Mr. President, Alexander said carefully, what would it take for you to support stronger environmental protections in the Northfield Agreement? Not as a political concession, but as a policy you could genuinely endorse. Steele considered the question seriously. I need to see convincing evidence that environmental protections wouldn't kill American jobs or put American companies at a competitive disadvantage. And I need assurance that any environmental standards we agree to would be applied fairly to all countries, not just used as an excuse to discriminate against American businesses. Those seem like reasonable requests, Alexander replied. What if we could structure the agreement so that environmental compliance actually created new economic opportunities? Green technology development, sustainable energy projects, environmental consulting services. That's interesting, Steele said, leaning forward slightly. Tell me more about what you have in mind. For the next 15 minutes, the two men engaged in the kind of substantive policy discussion that rarely occurred in formal diplomatic settings. Alexander outlined his vision for environmental protection that enhanced rather than hindered economic development, while Steele explained the practical political constraints that limited his flexibility on environmental issues. Neither man was converted to the other's worldview, but both gained a deeper understanding of the reasoning behind their counterparts' positions. More importantly, they identified potential areas where their different priorities might actually complement rather than conflict with each other. As their meeting concluded, both felt cautiously optimistic that the day's formal negotiations might produce more progress than either had initially expected. They shook hands warmly and prepared to rejoin their respective delegations for the continuation of official talks. What neither man knew was that James Morrison's report had begun circulating beyond the American delegation. Dr. Williams, still concerned about the accuracy of Morrison's characterization of President Steele's comments, had forwarded portions of the report to a colleague at the State Department, asking for guidance on how to address potential inconsistencies in the official record. That colleague, Dr. Michael Torres, served as a liaison between the State Department and various congressional committees that overseen foreign policy issues. Torres had worked on Capitol Hill before joining the executive branch, and he maintained relationships with staffers from both parties who specialized in international relations. Reading Williams' email during his morning commute to Washington, Torres was struck by the inflammatory language attributed to President Steele in Morrison's report. While he had no independent knowledge of what Steele had actually said, the quote seemed inconsistent with the administration's stated approach to the Valdorian negotiations. More concerning from Torres' perspective was the potential for political embarrassment if Morrison's characterization proved inaccurate. Congressional Republicans would likely criticize the administration if it appeared the president had damaged relations with an important ally through careless comments, while Democrats would seize on any evidence that Steele had been disrespectful to foreign leaders. Torres decided to forward Williams' inquiry to his former colleague, Jennifer Hayes, who now served as foreign policy advisor to Senator Robert Martinez, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Hayes had spent years tracking the administration's diplomatic initiatives, and Torres thought she might have insight into whether Morrison's report reflected established patterns in Steele's approach to international negotiations. This decision, made quickly during a busy morning commute, would prove to have consequences far beyond Torres' intentions. Hayes, ambitious and politically astute, immediately recognized the potential significance of Morrison's report. If President Steele had indeed made disparaging comments about Prince Alexander during sensitive diplomatic negotiations, it could represent a significant failure of diplomatic protocol with serious implications for American-Valdorian relations. Hayes knew that Senator Martinez had been positioning himself as a critic of the administration's approach to environmental issues and international cooperation. Evidence that President Steele had insulted a respected environmental advocate like Prince Alexander would provide ammunition for broader criticisms of the administration's diplomatic competence and environmental policy. But Hayes also understood the importance of verifying information before acting on it. She had seen too many political scandals fizzle when initial reports proved exaggerated or inaccurate. She made a note to research Morrison's background and credibility while also beginning to draft talking points for Senator Martinez that could be activated if the story gained traction. Back at Pemberton Castle, the second day's formal negotiations were proceeding with renewed energy following the private meeting between Steele and Alexander. The morning session focused on technical specifications for environmental monitoring and compliance verification, areas where the previous day's philosophical disagreements could be translated into specific procedural agreements. Chun led the American team through detailed proposals for oversight mechanisms that would satisfy Valdorian environmental concerns while maintaining reasonable timelines for project implementation. Dame Elizabeth responded with equally detailed suggestions for international monitoring and scientific review processes that would provide credible assurance of environmental protection. Prince Alexander participated actively in the discussions, demonstrating the technical knowledge that backed up his environmental advocacy. His interventions were informed by scientific research and economic analysis, impressing even skeptical members of the American delegation with his command of complex policy details. President Steele found himself viewing the negotiations differently following his morning conversation with Alexander. While he hadn't changed his fundamental positions, he was more willing to consider creative solutions that might address both countries' concerns. The personal connection established during their private meeting had humanized the policy disagreements in a way that made compromise seem possible rather than merely politically expedient. What if we phased implementation over 3 years? Steele suggested during one particularly complex discussion of monitoring requirements. Year 1 would focus on baseline environmental assessments, Year 2 would establish monitoring infrastructure, and Year 3 would begin limited development with full oversight protocols in place. It was exactly the kind of creative compromise that experienced diplomats hoped for, but rarely achieved in high-stakes negotiations. The suggestion addressed Valdorian concerns about rushing into development without adequate environmental protection, while also providing American businesses with a clear timeline for moving forward with investment decisions. Dame Elizabeth and Prince Alexander exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of Steele's willingness to accept a longer implementation timeline. For the American president, who faced constant pressure from business interests to expedite regulatory processes, the 3-year timeline represented a genuine concession to environmental priorities. Mr. President, Dame Elizabeth said carefully, "That's a very constructive suggestion. We would need to ensure that the environmental assessments in Year 1 were comprehensive and scientifically rigorous, but the phased approach could work very well." The momentum from Steele's proposal carried through the rest of the morning session, with both sides building on the 3-year framework to address other contentious issues. By lunch break, The negotiating teams had drafted preliminary language for several key sections of the agreement, far more progress than anyone had expected after the first day's tensions. During the lunch recess, both delegations felt cautiously optimistic that they might achieve a substantive agreement rather than merely a face-saving joint statement. The personal rapport between Steele and Alexander had created space for the kind of detailed policy work that formed the backbone of successful international agreements. But while the negotiators were making progress, the political environment surrounding the summit was becoming increasingly complicated. Jennifer Hayes had spent the morning researching James Morrison's background and cross-referencing his report with other available information about the previous day's negotiations. Morrison's resume revealed an ambitious young staffer with limited diplomatic experience, but strong connections within the administration's political operation. He had worked on Steele's presidential campaign before joining the foreign policy staff, and his previous assignments had focused more on domestic political implications of international issues than on traditional diplomatic protocol. This background made Hayes more suspicious of Morrison's report, particularly the editorial commentary that went beyond simple factual reporting. Political operatives often viewed diplomatic negotiations through the lens of domestic advantage rather than international relationship building, and Morrison's interpretation of Steele's comments seemed to reflect that perspective. However, Hayes also recognized that Morrison's political background didn't necessarily discredit his observations. Campaign veterans often had better access to senior officials and more insight into their real thinking than career diplomats who were kept at arm's length from political decision-making. As Hayes weighed the evidence, she received a call from David Park, a reporter for the Washington Herald who specialized in congressional oversight and diplomatic affairs. Park had developed Hayes as a source during previous investigations, and he regularly checked with her about potential stories involving international relations and Senate Foreign Relations Committee jurisdiction. "Jen," Park said after their usual pleasantries, "I'm hearing rumors about some kind of incident during the Valdorian summit. Something about President Steele making inappropriate comments about Prince Alexander. Any truth to that?" Hayes felt her pulse quicken. If Park was already hearing rumors, it meant that Morrison's report was circulating more widely than she had realized. Other journalists might soon be pursuing the same story, and Senator Martinez might need to be prepared to respond to media inquiries. "David," she replied carefully, "I can't comment on specific diplomatic communications, but if you're working on a story about the summit, you might want to focus on the environmental and trade issues being discussed. That's where the real substance is." It was a classic Washington non-denial denial, designed to avoid confirming or denying the story while steering the reporter towards safer ground. But Park was experienced enough to recognize that Hayes' careful response actually confirmed that there was a story to pursue. "Okay," Park said, "but if something develops that the senator needs to comment on, you'll give me a heads up?" "Of course," Hayes replied, ending the call with a growing sense that events were moving beyond her control. The afternoon session at Pemberton Castle began with both sides building on the morning's progress, working through implementation details and compliance mechanisms with the kind of technical focus that characterized successful negotiations. President Steele participated actively, demonstrating the policy knowledge that had surprised many observers throughout his political career. But at 3:30 p.m., just as the negotiations were reaching a crucial point in discussions about international oversight mechanisms, Chen received an urgent message from the White House Communications Office. The message was brief but alarming. "Media inquiries about POTUS comments re. Prince Alexander. Need immediate clarification." Chen excused herself from the negotiations and stepped into an adjacent room to place a secure call to Washington. The call connected her with White House Press Secretary Amanda Foster, who had been fielding inquiries from multiple news organizations about alleged comments by President Steele regarding Prince Alexander. "Margaret," Foster said without preamble, "I need you to tell me exactly what the president said yesterday about Prince Alexander, and I need you to tell me right now. David Park at the Herald is working on a story, and he has details that suggest there was some kind of incident." Chun felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Amanda, I was present for all of the president's interactions with Prince Alexander yesterday. There was no incident. The president was diplomatic and professional throughout. What about informal conversations? Coffee breaks, dinner, private meetings? The president had one brief informal conversation with the prince during a coffee break, but it was entirely cordial. They discussed policy differences, but there was nothing inappropriate or insulting. Okay, Foster said, but someone is telling Park that the president made disparaging comments about the prince's environmental positions and his role in the negotiations. Do you have any idea where that might be coming from? Chen's mind immediately went to the various staff reports and briefing documents that were produced after every international meeting. Amanda, there are always staff reports that characterize interactions and provide analysis. It's possible that someone's interpretation or commentary is being confused with direct quotes. Find out, Foster said urgently, and find out fast. Park is planning to run something tonight, and if we can't provide accurate information, he's going to run with what he has. Chun returned to the negotiations with her mind racing. She needed to track down the source of the media reports without disrupting the progress being made in the formal talks. But she also knew that if inaccurate stories about President Steele's comments began circulating, it could destroy the positive momentum that had been building throughout the day. As the afternoon session continued, both Prince Alexander and King Edmund remained focused on the substantive discussions, unaware that their summit was about to be overshadowed by a media controversy that would test both their diplomatic skills and their personal relationship with President Steele. The irony was bitter. Just as the negotiations were producing genuine progress on complex policy issues, political forces beyond the negotiating room were threatening to undermine everything both sides had worked to accomplish. The secure phone in Secretary Chen's temporary office buzzed insistently at 4:47 p.m., interrupting her frantic review of staff reports and communication logs. The caller ID showed White House Chief of Staff Thomas Bradley, which meant the situation had escalated beyond the press office's ability to manage. Margaret, Bradley's voice was tight with controlled urgency. We have a problem. David Park just sent over his questions for the president, and he's claiming to have direct quotes from a staff report about comments regarding Prince Alexander. We need answers, and we need them in the next 2 hours. Chen had spent the past hour trying to piece together how James Morrison's internal report had reached the media. Her investigation had revealed a trail of forwards and communications that stretched from the summit back to Washington, involving State Department liaisons, congressional staff, and ultimately journalists. What had begun as routine internal documentation had somehow transformed into an international incident. Tom, she said, pulling up Morrison's report on her laptop. I think I know what happened. There's a trip report from one of our junior staffers that contains interpretive commentary rather than direct quotes. The language is inflammatory, but it doesn't accurately reflect what actually occurred. Show me, Bradley said, and Chun could hear him typing in the background as she read portions of Morrison's report over the secure line. Morrison's document contained several problematic passages. He had written that President Steele expressed frustration with Prince Alexander's naive environmental extremism and had described the prince as an obstacle to rational economic cooperation. Most damaging was Morrison's claim that the president had privately referred to Alexander as a privileged kid playing games with issues he doesn't understand. The problem was that none of these characterizations reflected direct quotes from President Steele. Instead, they represented Morrison's interpretation of the president's positions, filtered through his own political biases and ambitions. But the way Morrison had written the report made it appear as though he was documenting actual statements rather than providing analysis. Jesus, Bradley muttered after Chen finished reading. How did this kid get clearance for international assignments? He worked on the campaign, Chen replied, knowing that Bradley would understand the implications. Campaign veterans often received government positions based on political loyalty rather than relevant experience, and their transition to diplomatic work didn't always go smoothly. Okay, Bradley said, Here's what we're going to do. You need to get Morrison on the phone immediately and get him to clarify exactly what he heard versus what he interpreted. I'm going to brief the president and figure out how to respond to Park's inquiries. And, Margaret, this doesn't leave the negotiating team until we figure out how to handle it. But even as Bradley spoke, both he and Chun knew that containing the story would be nearly impossible. In the modern media environment, once a story like this began circulating among journalists and political operatives, it developed momentum that was difficult to stop. The question wasn't whether the story would be published, but how much damage it would cause to the negotiations and to American Valdorian relations. Meanwhile, the afternoon negotiating session at Pemberton Castle was reaching a crucial juncture. The technical teams had worked through most of the implementation details for the phased development timeline, and both sides were preparing to present draft language for their leaders' final review. Prince Alexander had been particularly engaged in discussions about environmental monitoring standards, demonstrating the scientific expertise that had made him a credible voice on climate issues. His contributions were detailed, practical, and focused on ensuring that economic development could proceed without compromising environmental protection. The key, Alexander explained during one technical discussion, is establishing baseline measurements before any development begins. That way, we can track changes accurately and respond quickly if problems develop. President Steele found himself impressed by the prince's knowledge and pragmatic approach. This wasn't the idealistic activism that Steele had expected, but rather sophisticated policy thinking backed by genuine expertise. The morning's private conversation had established a foundation of mutual respect that was now enabling productive collaboration on complex issues. Your Highness, Steele said as they reviewed monitoring protocols, this framework could actually become a model for other development projects. If we can prove that environmental protection and economic development can work together, it might change how these issues are approached globally. It was exactly the kind of visionary thinking that Alexander hoped to encourage in political leaders, and he felt genuinely optimistic about the potential for breakthrough agreements that could benefit both countries while advancing environmental protection. But their collaborative momentum was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. At 5:15 p.m., Chen received an urgent text message from her deputy in Washington. Park running story tonight. WH preparing statement. The message meant that despite their efforts to clarify Morrison's report, the media controversy was moving forward on its own timeline. Chun faced an agonizing decision. She could interrupt the negotiations to brief President Steele about the developing media storm, potentially derailing the progress they had made. Or she could allow the formal session to continue while hoping that the White House communications team could manage the story without requiring input from the negotiating team. She chose a middle course, passing a discreet note to President Steele during a brief recess that read simply, "Media issued developing. We'll brief you privately after today's session." Steele glanced at the note, nodded slightly to acknowledge receipt, and returned his attention to the negotiations. His political experience had taught him to compartmentalize crises, dealing with immediate responsibilities while trusting his staff to manage developing problems. The final hour of negotiations proceeded smoothly, with both sides finalizing language for several key sections of the agreement. By 6:30 p.m., they had draft documents that addressed most of the major issues that had brought them to Pemberton Castle, representing genuine compromises that served both countries' interests. "Ladies and gentlemen," King Edmund said as the formal session concluded, "I believe we've accomplished something significant here. These agreements represent exactly the kind of international cooperation that our peoples expect from their leaders." President Steele nodded in agreement. "Your Majesty, Your Highness, I want to thank you for the constructive approach you've brought to these discussions. We've proven that countries with different priorities can work together when both sides commit to finding solutions." The mood in the room was genuinely positive as both delegations prepared for the evening's formal dinner and the following day's signing ceremony. Career diplomats from both countries exchanged congratulations on the successful conclusion of complex negotiations, while political leaders looked forward to announcing agreements that would benefit their respective constituencies. But even as the negotiators celebrated their success, the political landscape was shifting in Washington. David Park's story was scheduled for publication at midnight Eastern Time, which would be 5 a.m. at Pemberton Castle. By the time the delegations woke up for their final day of meetings, they would be confronting an international incident that could overshadow everything they had accomplished. Park's story, titled Summit Tensions, President Steele's private comments on Valdorian Prince sparked diplomatic concerns, relied heavily on Morrison's report, while also including analysis from unnamed congressional sources and former diplomatic officials. The article presented Morrison's interpretive commentary as factual reporting, creating the impression that President Steele had deliberately insulted Prince Alexander during sensitive negotiations. More damaging than the specific quotes was the story's broader narrative, which portrayed the summit as a diplomatic failure caused by President Steele's inability to work constructively with international partners who disagreed with his positions. The article suggested that American diplomatic influence was declining because of the president's confrontational approach to international relations. At 11:30 p.m. Washington time, White House Press Secretary Amanda Foster released a statement attempting to clarify the situation. President Steele's conversations with Valdorian leaders have been professional and productive throughout the summit. Any reports suggesting inappropriate comments are based on mischaracterizations of internal staff analysis rather than accurate reporting of the president's statements. But Foster's statement had the unintended effect of confirming that there was indeed a story to be told, while also raising questions about the accuracy of the administration's internal reporting procedures. Political opponents immediately seized on the controversy as evidence of broader problems with the administration's diplomatic competence. Senator Robert Martinez, ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, issued his own statement within an hour of the White House response. If these reports are accurate, President Steele has damaged relations with one of our closest allies through careless and inappropriate comments. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee will be seeking a full briefing on these negotiations and any incidents that may have occurred. The political machinery of Washington was now fully engaged, with congressional Democrats preparing oversight hearings and Republican leaders scrambling to defend the president while also distancing themselves from any diplomatic failures. The story was being covered not just as a foreign policy issue, but as a domestic political crisis with implications for the administration's credibility and competence. At Pemberton Castle, neither delegation was yet aware of the media storm developing across the Atlantic. The evening's formal dinner proceeded with the diplomatic courtesy and personal warmth that had characterized the second day of negotiations. President Steele and Prince Alexander sat together during dinner, continuing their policy discussions in a more relaxed setting. "Mr. President," Alexander said over dessert, "I want you to know how much I've appreciated your willingness to consider our environmental concerns seriously. Too often, these kinds of negotiations become zero-sum competitions where someone has to lose for someone else to win." Steele raised his wine glass in a modest toast. "Your Highness, you've changed my thinking about how environmental protection and economic development can work together. That's not something that happens often in my line of work." The conversation was genuine and friendly, reflecting the mutual respect that had developed between two leaders who had initially viewed each other with suspicion. Both men felt that they had accomplished something meaningful, not just for their countries, but for the broader challenge of international cooperation on global issues. What neither man realized was that their successful collaboration was about to be overshadowed by a media narrative that portrayed their relationship as confrontational and their negotiations as a diplomatic failure. The irony was profound. At the exact moment when American and Valdorian leaders were demonstrating how to bridge political differences through respectful dialogue and creative compromise, political forces in Washington were creating a crisis that could destroy everything they had accomplished. As the evening concluded and both delegations retired to prepare for the final day ceremonies, the first international news outlets were beginning to pick up Park's story. European media, always sensitive to tensions between America and its allies, started preparing their own coverage of what appeared to be another example of American diplomatic clumsiness under President Steele's leadership. The stage was set for a final day that would test not only the strength of the agreements reached during 2 days of negotiations, but also the personal relationships that had made those agreements possible. The question was whether the bonds of trust and respect established between President Steele and Prince Alexander would survive the political storm that was about to engulf them both. In her hotel room, Secretary Chun was still working at midnight, trying to develop a communication strategy that could salvage the summit's achievements while addressing legitimate concerns about the administration's internal reporting procedures. She knew that the next few hours would determine whether the Pemberton Castle negotiations would be remembered as a diplomatic breakthrough or as another example of political controversy undermining international relations. The secure phone rang again, and Chun steeled herself for another crisis update from Washington. But this time, the caller was Dame Elizabeth Thornton, and her voice carried a tone that Chun had never heard before. "Margaret," Dame Elizabeth said carefully, "I need to discuss with you some information that has just reached our delegation. It concerns President Steele's reported comments about Prince Alexander." Chun's heart sank. If the Valdorian delegation had learned about the media reports, everything was about to become much more complicated. The final day of the summit, which should have been a celebration of successful negotiations, was instead going to be a test of whether diplomatic relationships could survive political controversies that had nothing to do with the substance of international cooperation. The first rays of sunlight filtering through the ancient windows of Pemberton Castle carried with them the weight of an international crisis that neither delegation had anticipated. At 5:47 a.m. local time, Dame Elizabeth Thornton's secure phone had buzzed with an urgent message from the Valdorian Foreign Ministry. American media reporting disparaging comments about Prince Alexander. Need immediate briefing. Dame Elizabeth had spent her career managing diplomatic crises, but few situations had required such delicate handling. The media reports suggested that President Steele had insulted Prince Alexander during private conversations, directly contradicting her own observations of their interactions. Yet the political implications of the story threatened to overshadow the substantive agreements that both sides had worked so hard to achieve. Her call to Secretary Chun the previous evening had been carefully calibrated to gather information without triggering a defensive response from the American delegation. Both women understood that their country's relationship was strong enough to survive misunderstandings, but both also knew that political pressure could force leaders into positions that damaged long-term interests for short-term advantage. "Margaret," Dame Elizabeth had said during their midnight conversation, "our embassy in Washington has received inquiries from several news organizations about President Steele's supposed comments regarding Prince Alexander. Before we respond, we'd like to understand what actually occurred." Chun had explained the situation with Morrison's report, emphasizing that the inflammatory language reflected staff interpretation rather than presidential statements. Dame Elizabeth had listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the distinction between direct quotes and analytical commentary. "I see," Dame Elizabeth had said finally. "So this appears to be a case of internal analysis being mischaracterized as factual reporting." "Exactly," Chun had replied. "The president's actual interactions with Prince Alexander have been respectful and productive. Yesterday's private meeting was particularly constructive, but both diplomats knew that the accuracy of the reports mattered less than their political impact. In the modern media environment, perceptions often became reality regardless of underlying facts. If the story gained traction, both leaders would be forced to respond to political pressure rather than focusing on diplomatic substance. Now, as dawn broke over the castle, both delegations were grappling with how to handle the final day of the summit. The original agenda called for a formal signing ceremony followed by joint press conferences, but the media controversy had created a minefield of potential pitfalls. Prince Alexander had been awakened at 6:15 a.m. by his private secretary, who briefed him on the American media reports while he prepared for the day. The prince's initial reaction was confusion rather than anger. His interactions with President Steele have been entirely professional, and their policy disagreements have been handled with mutual respect. Sir, his secretary explained, the report suggests that President Steele made private comments characterizing your environmental positions as naive extremism and referring to you personally in derogatory terms. Alexander reviewed the key passages of Park's article on his tablet, noting the inflammatory language attributed to an unnamed administration source. His diplomatic training helped him recognize immediately that the quotes sounded more like political spin than actual presidential statements. "This doesn't match my experience with President Steele," Alexander told his secretary. "Our conversations have been substantive and respectful, even when we disagreed on policy issues." But Alexander also understood the political dynamics at play. American domestic politics often required leaders to appear tough in international negotiations, and criticism of foreign leaders was a common way to demonstrate strength to domestic audiences. Even if President Steele hadn't made the specific comments attributed to him, the story would create pressure for both sides to take public positions that might complicate their private cooperation. Meanwhile, President Steele was receiving his own briefing about the media coverage. Chief of Staff Bradley had flown overnight to Pemberton Castle, arriving with a communications team and detailed analysis of the political fallout developing in Washington. "Mr. President," Bradley said as he spread newspapers and printed articles across the coffee table in Steele's suite, "this has become a full-scale political crisis. Congressional Democrats are demanding hearings, environmental groups are calling for boycotts, and our allies are questioning our diplomatic competence." Steele studied the coverage with the analytical approach he brought to all political challenges. He had weathered numerous media storms throughout his career, and he understood that the key to managing controversies was to separate substantive issues from political theater. "Tom," he said finally, "what are our options?" "We have three basic approaches," Bradley replied. "First, we can dismiss the story as fake news and attack the media for irresponsible reporting. Second, we can acknowledge errors in staff reporting while emphasizing the positive outcomes of the negotiations. Third, we can have you personally apologize to Prince Alexander, even though you didn't actually make the comments attributed to you." Each option carried significant risks. Attacking the media might satisfy Steele's political base, but could alienate international allies who were already concerned about American diplomatic behavior. Acknowledging staff errors might minimize immediate damage, but could raise questions about the administration's internal procedures. Apologizing for comments he hadn't made might resolve the immediate crisis, but would validate inaccurate reporting and set a dangerous precedent. "What's your recommendation?" Steele asked. "Option 2. Bradley said without hesitation. "We acknowledge that staff analysis was mischaracterized as direct quotes. We emphasize the successful outcomes of the negotiations, and we use this as an opportunity to highlight your personal relationship with Prince Alexander." It was a sophisticated approach that addressed legitimate concerns while also advancing the administration's political interests. But it required careful coordination with the Valdorian delegation to ensure that both sides presented consistent messages. At 8:30 a.m., Chun called Dame Elizabeth to propose a joint strategy session before the day's formal events. Both delegations needed to decide how to handle the media coverage without damaging either the substantive agreements they had reached or the personal relationships that had made those agreements possible. The strategy session convened in a secure conference room with the senior staff from both delegations, but without the principals. Chun, Dame Elizabeth, and their respective communications advisors needed to develop a framework that both leaders could accept. "The fundamental question," Dame Elizabeth said, "is whether we allow this media controversy to overshadow the substantial progress we've made on policy issues." "Agreed," Chun replied. "Our recommendation is to have both leaders address the story directly, emphasizing their positive working relationship while also clarifying the distinction between staff analysis and actual statements." But the Valdorian team had additional concerns. Prince Alexander's reputation for environmental advocacy made him a target for political attacks from American conservatives, while his role as heir to the throne required careful management of public controversies. Any response needed to protect both his political effectiveness and his constitutional position. Prince Alexander is prepared to state publicly that his interactions with President Steele have been professional and productive, Dame Elizabeth said. But we cannot have him appear to be defending American domestic political positions at the expense of Valdorian environmental priorities. The delicate balance required both leaders to validate each other's character while maintaining their distinct policy positions. President Steele needed to demonstrate respect for Prince Alexander without appearing to compromise American economic interests. Prince Alexander needed to affirm Steele's professionalism without endorsing American environmental policies. After 2 hours of discussion, both teams had developed a framework that addressed their respective concerns. The plan called for a joint statement emphasizing the successful negotiations, followed by separate press conferences where each leader would address the media reports in ways that served their domestic political needs while preserving the international relationship. But as the communications teams worked out the details, events in Washington were creating additional pressure. Senator Martinez had scheduled a press conference for noon Eastern Time, where he planned to call for congressional investigation of the summit and broader review of the administration's diplomatic procedures. Environmental groups had organized protests outside the White House, demanding that President Steele apologize to Prince Alexander and commit to stronger environmental protections. Conservative media was defending Steele while also questioning why American leaders needed to show deference to foreign environmental activists. The political polarization that characterized American domestic politics was now being projected onto international relations, forcing diplomatic partners to navigate not just policy disagreements, but also the partisan conflicts that shaped American political discourse. At 11 a.m. Castle time, President Steele and Prince Alexander met privately to discuss how to handle the media controversy. Both men understood that their personal relationship had become a political issue that extended far beyond their individual preferences or policy positions. "Your Highness," Steele began, "I want you to know that I deeply regret this situation. The media reports don't accurately reflect my views or our conversations." Alexander appreciated the direct approach. "Mr. President, I understand the complexity of American politics, and I don't hold you responsible for staff reports or media interpretations. My concern is ensuring that this controversy doesn't undermine the agreements we've reached." "That's exactly what I want to discuss," Steele replied. "How do we protect what we've accomplished while also addressing the political pressure both of us are facing?" For the next 30 minutes, the two leaders worked through the communication strategy their staffs had developed, making adjustments based on their own political needs and personal comfort levels. Both men were experienced enough to understand that managing public perception was as important as negotiating policy substance. "The irony," Alexander observed, "is that we've actually demonstrated how leaders with different views can work together constructively. But the media narrative focuses on conflict rather than cooperation." "Welcome to modern politics," Steele replied with a wry smile. "The harder you work to find common ground, the more the press wants to write about your disagreements." Their conversation was interrupted by an aide informing them that the signing ceremony was scheduled to begin in 1 hour. Both delegations had agreed to proceed with the formal conclusion of negotiations while also preparing to address the media controversy through carefully planned statements. The signing ceremony took place in the castle's Grand Hall, with both delegations arranged formally around an ornate table laden with the documents they had spent 3 days crafting. The agreements represented genuine achievements in international cooperation, addressing complex trade issues, environmental protection, and economic development in ways that serve both countries' interests. King Edmund spoke first, emphasizing the historical significance of the agreements and the importance of international cooperation in addressing global challenges. President Steele followed, highlighting the economic benefits for both countries while also acknowledging the environmental protections that had been incorporated into the final documents. Prince Alexander's brief remarks focused on the potential for the agreements to serve as a model for sustainable development projects worldwide. His comments were substantive and forward-looking, demonstrating exactly the kind of informed environmental advocacy that had impressed the American delegation throughout the negotiations. But even as the ceremony proceeded with diplomatic grace, both sides knew that the real test would come during the press conferences scheduled for immediately afterward. The media would focus primarily on the controversy rather than the substance, forcing both leaders to demonstrate their personal relationship while also addressing domestic political concerns. President Steele's press conference began with a detailed explanation of the policy agreements, but questions quickly shifted to Morrison's report and the media coverage. Steele responded with a measured approach his communications team had developed. The reports you've seen are based on staff analysis that was mischaracterized as direct quotes, he said. My interactions with Prince Alexander have been professional, productive, and respectful throughout these negotiations. The prince is a knowledgeable leader who has contributed significantly to our discussions. When pressed about whether he had criticized Prince Alexander's environmental positions, Steele pivoted to policy substance. The prince and I have different perspectives on how to balance environmental protection with economic development. Those are legitimate policy disagreements, but we found ways to address both countries' concerns through creative compromise. Prince Alexander's press conference an hour later struck a similar tone, emphasizing the successful negotiations while addressing the media reports directly. President Steele has been a respectful and engaged negotiating partner, he said. While we have different priorities on some issues, we've demonstrated that international cooperation is possible when leaders approach discussions in good faith. Both press conferences accomplished their immediate objectives, defending the personal relationship between the leaders while acknowledging policy differences in ways that satisfied domestic political requirements. But the broader media narrative remained focused on conflict rather than cooperation, illustrating the challenges facing international diplomacy in an era of political polarization and social media amplification. As the final day of the summit concluded, both delegations could point to substantial achievements in policy terms while also having successfully managed a political crisis that could have derailed everything they had accomplished. The personal relationship between President Steele and Prince Alexander had not only survived the controversy, but had actually been strengthened by their joint response to unfair media characterizations. However, the incident also highlighted the fragility of international relations in the modern political environment, where staff reports could become international incidents and domestic political pressures could threaten diplomatic progress on global challenges. Both leaders returned to their respective countries with hard-won agreements in hand, but also with new appreciation for how quickly political theater could overshadow policy substance in contemporary international relations. 6 months after the Pemberton Castle Summit, the reverberations of what became known as the Alexander Incident continued to shape both American domestic politics and international diplomatic relations in ways that neither delegation could have anticipated. The immediate crisis had been successfully managed through careful communication strategy and genuine cooperation between President Steele and Prince Alexander, but the broader implications proved more complex and enduring. In Washington, the incident had triggered a comprehensive review of diplomatic reporting procedures and staff training protocols. Chief of Staff Bradley had commissioned an internal investigation that revealed systemic problems with how junior staffers interpreted and documented international negotiations. James Morrison, the staffer whose report had sparked the crisis, was quietly reassigned to a domestic policy role where his political instincts would be less likely to create diplomatic problems. The investigation's findings were sobering for the administration. Multiple incidents were identified where staff reports had contained interpretive commentary that could have been mischaracterized as factual documentation, suggesting that the Morrison report was symptomatic of broader institutional problems rather than an isolated case of poor judgment. We discovered that our training programs focused heavily on political analysis, but provided inadequate guidance on diplomatic protocol and International relationship management, explained Dr. Sarah Williams, who had been tasked with developing new procedures after raising initial concerns about Morrison's report. The reforms implemented following the investigation established clear distinctions between factual reporting and analytical commentary, mandatory training programs for staff assigned to international negotiations, and enhanced oversight procedures for documents that could affect diplomatic relationships. The changes were welcomed by career diplomats who had long worried about the intersection of political operations and traditional diplomatic work. But the institutional reforms addressed only part of the challenge revealed by the Alexander incident. The episode had also exposed how quickly domestic political pressures could complicate international relationships, particularly when media coverage focused on controversy rather than policy substance. Senator Martinez's Foreign Relations Committee had conducted 3 hearings on the incident, ostensibly focused on diplomatic procedures, but actually designed to score political points against the Steele administration. The hearings generated significant media coverage, but little substantive policy discussion, illustrating how congressional oversight could become another form of political theater. What we learned, observed Dame Elizabeth Thornton in a private interview 6 months later, was that American domestic politics increasingly treats international relations as an extension of partisan conflict rather than a distinct area requiring bipartisan cooperation. The phenomenon wasn't unique to American politics, but the global influence of American media and political culture meant that domestic American conflicts often spilled over into international relations in ways that complicated diplomacy for all parties involved. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had catalyzed broader discussions about the role of media in diplomatic relations. David Park's original story, while based on accurate reporting of Morrison's document, had presented staff interpretation as factual documentation in ways that created an international incident from what should have been internal analytical discussion. The Columbia Journalism School had conducted a detailed case study of the incident, concluding that traditional journalistic standards for verifying sources and distinguishing between facts and interpretation needed to be updated for an era when government documents themselves often blurred those distinctions. The Morrison Report wasn't traditional disinformation, explained Professor Janet Richardson, who led the Columbia study. It was a case where institutional practices within government created documents that appeared factual but actually contained significant interpretive elements. Journalists need better tools for analyzing these kinds of sources. The study's recommendations included enhanced verification procedures for government documents, clearer disclosure of when sources were providing analysis rather than direct observation, and better training for journalists covering international relations in an era of increased political polarization. Meanwhile, the policy agreements reached at Pemberton Castle had proven remarkably successful, validating the collaborative approach that President Steele and Prince Alexander had developed despite their initial philosophical differences. The 3-year implementation timeline had allowed for comprehensive environmental assessment, while also providing American businesses with clear parameters for investment decisions. The environmental monitoring protocols established under the agreements had detected and addressed several potential problems before they could cause significant damage, demonstrating the effectiveness of the compromise approach both leaders had crafted. More importantly, the success of the Pemberton Agreements had influenced similar negotiations in other parts of the world, creating a template for balancing economic development with environmental protection. The Pemberton model has become a gold standard for sustainable development agreements, noted Dr. Michael Torres, who had moved from a State Department to direct the International Institute for Environmental Diplomacy. It proves that environmental protection and economic development can be mutually reinforcing when properly structured. Prince Alexander had leveraged the success of the agreements to expand his environmental advocacy, speaking at international conferences and advising other governments on sustainable development policies. His collaboration with President Steele had enhanced his credibility with business leaders and conservative politicians who had previously dismissed environmental advocates as impractical idealists. Working with President Steele taught me that environmental advocacy is most effective when it addresses economic concerns rather than dismissing them, Alexander reflected during a speech at the World Economic Forum. The business community is willing to embrace environmental protection when it's presented as an opportunity for innovation and growth rather than a constraint on economic activity. For President Steele, the incident had reinforced lessons about the importance of personal relationships in international diplomacy. His growing friendship with Prince Alexander had survived the media controversy and continued to influence both leaders' approaches to policy issues extending far beyond the original Northfield Islands negotiations. Alex and I talk regularly about energy policy, climate initiatives, and trade issues, Steele revealed during an interview with Foreign Affairs magazine. Having that personal relationship means we can work through disagreements without them becoming public disputes. The ongoing relationship between the two leaders had produced several subsequent collaborations, including joint initiatives on renewable energy technology and international environmental standards. Their partnership had demonstrated that personal connections could bridge ideological differences in ways that formal diplomatic processes often couldn't achieve. Secretary Chun, who had been promoted to Deputy Secretary of State partly based on her handling of the Alexander incident, reflected on the broader lessons learned from the experience. The incident taught us that successful diplomacy requires managing both policy substance and political perception simultaneously. You can craft brilliant agreements, but they won't matter if political controversies undermine the relationships needed to implement them. Chen had become a leading advocate within the administration for treating diplomatic communication as a strategic discipline requiring the same level of attention given to domestic political messaging. Her recommendations had influenced how the administration approached subsequent international negotiations, with enhanced coordination between policy teams and communication specialists. The long-term impact of the Alexander incident extended beyond immediate procedural reforms to fundamental questions about how democracies conduct international relations in an era of intense political polarization and instant global communication. The episode had illustrated both the fragility and resilience of diplomatic relationships, showing how quickly misunderstandings could create crises while also demonstrating how personal trust could overcome political obstacles. International relations scholars had begun studying the incident as a case example of how traditional diplomatic practices needed to adapt to contemporary political and media environments. The episode provided insights into crisis management, the role of personal relationships in international negotiations, and the challenges of maintaining diplomatic continuity amid domestic political turbulence. The Alexander incident represents a new category of diplomatic challenge, wrote Harvard's Professor Sarah Kim in International Security. It wasn't caused by policy disagreements or strategic conflicts, but by the intersection of bureaucratic procedures, media practices, and political polarization. Understanding how to manage these kinds of challenges will be crucial for effective diplomacy in the 21st century. As the first anniversary of the Pemberton Castle Summit approached, both President Steele and Prince Alexander were planning to attend a commemorative conference focusing on the environmental and economic outcomes of their agreements. The event would provide an opportunity to celebrate policy successes while also discussing lessons learned from the media controversy that had threatened to overshadow their diplomatic achievements. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Alexander incident was its demonstration that international cooperation remained possible despite the political pressures that increasingly complicated diplomatic relations. President Steele and Prince Alexander had proven that leaders with fundamentally different worldviews could work together effectively when they approached negotiations with mutual respect, genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives, and commitment to finding solutions rather than scoring political points. Their partnership had evolved into a model for how international relationships could survive and even thrive amid domestic political controversies and media sensationalism. The personal trust they had developed during their private conversations at Pemberton Castle had created a foundation for ongoing cooperation that proved more durable than any formal agreement. The real lesson of our experience, Prince Alexander observed during a joint television interview with President Steele marking the anniversary of the summit, is that personal relationships matter in international relations. When leaders trust each other, they can work through any policy disagreement or political controversy. President Steele nodded in agreement. Alex, and I prove that you don't have to agree on everything to accomplish important things together. What matters is respecting each other enough to listen, learn, and find common ground where it exists. The interview, conducted from the same room at Pemberton Castle where they had first met privately, served as a powerful reminder that diplomatic success often depends more on human connections than on formal protocols or policy positions. The Alexander incident had tested those connections in the crucible of political controversy, but ultimately it had strengthened them by proving that genuine relationships could survive the pressures of modern international politics. As both leaders prepared to tackle new challenges in environmental policy, international trade, and global governance, their partnership provided a template for how democratic societies could engage constructively with the world despite the domestic political dynamics that increasingly complicated international relations. The incident that had threatened to divide them had instead created a foundation for ongoing collaboration that would influence international diplomacy for years to come. The story of the Alexander incident ultimately became a testament to the enduring importance of personal diplomacy in an age of institutional complexity and political polarization. It demonstrated that while modern communication technologies and political pressures could quickly create international crises, the fundamental human capacity for understanding, respect, and cooperation remained the most powerful tool for resolving conflicts and building sustainable relationships between nations.